I'd like to welcome Tushaar Shah, who is an emeritus professor from IMI in India, to the Water Underground's Water Underground Talk, Season 2. Welcome, Tushaar Shah.
Thank you, Tom.
Yeah, our first question is kind of a very personal question. How did you first develop a passion for water? Were there any particular incidents or people along the way that helped you define what you focused on and what you focus on in your research?
Well, no, actually, I just chanced into water research. I had an intention of, I was trained to be a banker, and I, soon after my PhD, I started teaching in this Institute of Rural Management, where young students are being trained to manage large farmer cooperatives in India. And that program has a very strong fieldwork component in which students go and live in villages with farmers, and professors also spend a part of the time with them. So in 1980, mid-1980s, I was spending my regulation time with students in a village in Gujarat. And I was basically curious about the trading in water that was taking place among farmers. And as an economist, I was kind of interested in water markets as an institution. So I kind of took a closer look and I started writing about that. And nobody else had written about that. So, I mean, water markets became very popular among researchers. And I mean, as it happens in research, if you start something new, then you keep getting more and more support. So you get sucked into that that area. And I never looked back. I kept on working on water without any formal training in water. But I picked up, interacted with people with technical backgrounds and picked up things on the way. But I never had any formal training in hydrology or hydrogeology.
I love that. Yeah, I love that. These the little moments in life that change a whole direction. That's really cool to hear about. Yeah, the season that we're recording for here is about these connections that you've built through your career between groundwater and sustainable development and even aspects of anti-racism or decolonization. So I'm wondering how these type of issues play out in some of the work that you've done and or just like where you live in India and surrounding regions.
So I didn't see any direct connection between groundwater and the racial stratification, but I got drawn into groundwater research because in the 1980s and 1990s, it had massive implications for rural poverty. And that was an area in which I was greatly interested. And I was, as I was doing more and more fieldwork, I figured that that groundwater wells were actually the mainstay of the poor in India. India is a very highly stratified society. But we don't call this race. We call it caste differences. India has numerous castes. So people are basically slaughtered at birth in different castes, and that in some ways conditions their life, the rest of their life. And people who are low born, they kind of have it, terrible predicament. And in my studies, I found that that small farmers from lower castes, they found that they could actually overcome their disadvantage in terms of low farm holding by actually just making a well, because that helped them intensify their smallholder farming, and they could take 2 or 3 crops in a year and support a family of 5 or 6. So I think overpopulation or population burden on farmland is one of the most important challenges that South Asia faces, India and Bangladesh in particular. And groundwater has been a big part of the solution, irrigation with groundwater. So I think there is a very, very major connect. And of course, it also connects with sustainability, because it is this democratic development of groundwater irrigation that actually has, stressed the resource in ways that are challenging for India. And I think that's a major groundwater governance challenge. I mean, there is a direct kind of tension between poverty reduction and groundwater, making groundwater use sustainable.
Yeah, no, thank you. That's wonderful. And I loved, in your earlier question, how you also drew out like how you brought in your role and your training as an economist to your approach to groundwater as it evolved through the years. And I'm wondering not just about your kind of disciplinary training, but also some of your personality. Like how did your personality or some of your personal interests even strengthen you as a scientist and as a practitioner who's aiming to make change in the world?
So I think as a management, as a person who kind of specialized in economics and management, I was always keen on finding practical solutions. So I kind of wanted to work on the praxis, on the common ground between science and policy. So for me and in my team too, we always kept on asking, so what can we do? I mean, how can we, how does it actually work out? What needs to change in order for things to get better? So I think that passion for finding practical solutions, which are politically feasible and which promise improvement in the situation. I think that's kind of shaped my research. So, and I also found it very useful.
Yeah, no, that's great. Yeah, I feel like I've grown into that myself as well. I feel like we can do so much research on so many different things, but if it doesn't matter and doesn't actually make a difference or could plausibly matter or make a difference, I just ignore it.
Exactly.
Yeah, life's too short to do anything else.
Yes. Yes.
I'm wondering in your career, if you've had any kind of personal experiences that have shaped your perspectives on some of the themes of this series of racism or sexism, and if you'd be interested in speaking about that.
Well, as I mentioned earlier, in the South Asian context, I think this speaking about social organization in a bigger setting it kind of makes a lot more sense than because racism is not as much of an issue in South Asia as this socioeconomic divide or stratification of society. So that has always been at the center of my research. But I think one aspect that shaped my work early on was actually what is now being labeled as water, energy, food nexus. I kind of ran into this in 1980s, which is long before the nexus became a very major theme. And actually, some of the work that I did in the 1980s and the policy changes that it led kind of kept my interest in this particular sphere. And that continues to over the past 40 years. I basically stayed with that theme. And I think it has been a very interesting clutch of issues to work on.
Yeah, you were in the nexus before it was even called the nexus. That's good.
Yes.
Yeah, totally.
Actually, in a book that I wrote in 1993, I used the word energy irrigation nexus. That probably was the first time.
Oh, cool. That's neat. Yeah. Is there one like lesson or like nugget, if you want to say, that you want to share with the next generation of groundwater scientists and practitioners that are hopefully going to be watching these videos in classrooms and in for their own learning?
Yeah, I think the main lesson is to basically keep an eye on the policy action. Make sure that it's not science for science sake. That we do good science, but I think we should also have an eye on how can we use it to change the way policymakers, decision makers decide on things that matter.
Yeah, thank you for that. That's a really useful nugget for everyone to hear. So the last question I'm going to ask is if there's one academic paper or book or even way of knowing that you think everyone should read, that it was a really important piece that you kind of went back to over time and yeah, be useful to share with people?
So I think when I was a young researcher, I was kind of deeply into modeling. So econometric modeling, not hydrological modeling, but econometric modeling. But the mindset was basically the same, that you get hold of data and try and build models. Those days we didn't have computers, so doing modeling was simple and it was very laborious. But still, the preoccupation was basically to get hold of data and try and interpret the world through that. But in my early years into water research, I ran into a British anthropologist called Robert Chambers, with whom I wrote a book. And he had a way of doing research that was completely opposite of mine. I mean, he basically was of the view that until you go down to the field and learn things yourself, you never really get the good feel. So he began me on this fieldwork trip that I used to do a lot of fieldwork, talk to farmers, try and understand the problem from their point of view. And I think it was this association with Robert Chambers in early years, and the obsession for learning from the field, and also then reinterpreting it for an intelligent audience in a manner that is that anybody can understand. I think that became a very. I then began to get frustrated with models. What models say.
Yeah.
And also for doing research that kind of, in a way, is incestuous. That you basically, there is a small community of researchers who are working on a particular theme, and you just keep talking to each other.
Sure.
And you want to kind of draw out, tease out the lessons, and take them to general public and to intelligent decision makers who kind of can process research-based or science-based output. So in some ways, the science journalism also kind of became, communicating results of scientific work in a manner that that can reach you out to decision makers. I think that became an important concern. So that associate with Robert Chambers was, I think, a very important.
Great. Well, thank you, Tushaar. We'll look forward to hearing a little bit more about your recent work in your presentation now.
So, continuing with the brief remarks that I made to set the backdrop to this presentation, I would just like to add that in around 2000, when Mr. Modi, who is the current Prime Minister, when Mr. Modi became the Chief Minister of Gujarat for the first time, he decided that providing villages 24/7 power supply was his key political strategy. So he basically started looking at the ways in which you could provide 24/7 power supply to rural communities. The main problem in doing that was farmers. That farmers who were using heavily subsidized power, they basically had, you could not provide 24/7 power supply without separating farmers or without disciplining farmers from, unlimited use of power for pumping groundwater. So we had basically argued in an EMI paper in 2001 that the best thing that the government of Gujarat can do is rewire the countryside, put all the farmers on a single feeder and the rest of the rural community on another feeder, which is called Jyotigram. Mr. Modi's government picked up on that idea, and they invested $250 million to rewire rural Gujarat, and they put all the farmers' tubewells on a separate agricultural feeder. After doing that, they imposed an 8-hour per day ration of power supply for farmers. They also introduced a rostering, that 1 week a village gets power during the daytime, in the next week the village gets power during the night. Now this put a cap on overall groundwater drought, because the total power that was delivered to farmers for pumping the tube wells was limited. So this had major beneficial impact. Drought, It reduced the subsidy burden on the electricity company. And the farmers were also surprisingly happy because they started getting better quality power at the time it was promised and without any major interruptions and at full voltage. So this was a very, very good regime. And actually, Gujarat was the only state where, despite runaway agricultural growth based on groundwater, the groundwater regime was actually improving year after year after year. Now, in 2015, for the first time, the solar pumps came up, and the solar pumps began to appear as a commercial possibility. The electricity companies found solar pumps very, very attractive because every grid-connected tube well that was replaced by a solar pump meant meant a saving of about $1,200 per year in terms of power subsidy to farmers. So the state electricity companies started persuading farmers to take solar pumps through a capital subsidy. So this is what happened. In today, Gujarat incurs $13 billion every year as subsidy on farm power supply. And the electricity companies find that if you replace grid-connected pumps by solar pumps, then it can massively reduce their subsidy burden. But solar pumps can threaten aquifers because at present the power that is supplied during the night on half the days of the year is actually seldom used because farmers find it very risky and hazardous to irrigate during the night. So effectively the power ration is very stringent. But once a farmer who is the grid power now, once he gets solar power, then he has 7 to 8 hours of power to pump his groundwater during daytime, free right through the year. And therefore, the apprehension is that replacing all the grid-connected pumps by solar pumps would deepen the groundwater draft in states like Gujarat. So in 2015, we got a small grant to actually experiment with smarter ways of promoting solar pumps instead of promoting them by giving farmers capital cost subsidy. Gujarat has been giving farmers solar pumps at 95% capital cost subsidy. That is, any grid-connected farmer, if he just chips in 5% of the capital cost, then the government just gives him the solar pump. And this we thought is a very dangerous proposition because it will be a real serious threat to groundwater. So in a village called Dhundi, what we did was we had 11 farmers who were using diesel pumps. We persuaded them to acquire solar pumps. We gave them a subsidy. We connected them into a microgrid, and we persuaded the local electricity company to connect this microgrid with the national grid at an 11 kV line. And the electricity company put a meter there, and it gave these 11 farmers a 25-year power purchase guarantee. They basically treated these farmers as independent power producers and basically guaranteed that for the next 25 years, they would buy all the surplus solar power that they generate, but don't use for irrigation. They'll buy them and they will pay them at 4 rupees and 63 paisa. That is about $55 per 1,000 units. Now, these farmers initially didn't understand what exactly did this mean, but because we had given them a subsidy and because diesel was very expensive, they readily accepted the solar pumps. So we created this microgrid, and we have been monitoring these 11 farmers over the past, since January 2016. Now in this chart, the basic data is plotted. The blue bar shows the amount of power that they used every month in irrigating, and the orange bar shows the amount of power that they evacuated to the grid and got paid at a rate of $55. In the first 3 years, we from our research grant also offered them an additional $25 per 1,000 units as water conservation bonus and as green power bonus. So that provided further incentive to farmers. So they were basically getting about $75 per 1,000 units in the first 3 or 4 years. Now this chart shows that nearly 65% of the energy that they generate is actually evacuated to the grid, and they use only about 30-35%. Also, their use of energy peaks during April and May, which are the hottest months when they want to grow high-value crops. But other than that, the use of energy is minimal. So I think this 11 farmer, one village pilot it attracted a lot of attention in media throughout India. And what the media found interesting was a small farmer making money by generating electricity and selling it to the grid. So there were a lot of newspaper reports, in national TV it came, and so on and so forth. And government of Gujarat also actually paid a lot of attention to this. And the major gains or the benefits that they saw was that, number one, in Dhundi, 100% of the solar energy that was generated was utilized. This could not be said about all the solar plants that were given on capital cost subsidy. Second, the farmers here had a strong incentive to conserve both energy and water because they were getting paid for conserving, for evacuating excess energy. Third, this created serious opportunity for an additional income for farmers. Actually, in Dhundi, farmers earned as much from selling electricity in net terms as they earned from growing crops. Then there was major reduction in technical and commercial losses of power. There was reduced subsidy burden on the electricity company and the government. There were carbon credit for the electricity company. And farmers managed the microgrid. So the electricity board's burden of managing a scattered rural grid was mitigated. So this was very attractive to electricity company, it was attractive to government, and it was also attractive to farmers. So it was seen as a win-win kind of a solution. So government of Gujarat launched a much bigger pilot in 2018 called Sky, Surya Shakti Kisan Yojana, whose objective was to pay farmers for generating solar energy on their fields and exporting solar energy for getting paid for it. So by 2019, some 91 rural feeders were solarized, on which 4,200 tube wells were connected. The grid connected tube wells were solarized. The solar pumps commissioned where the total capacity was about 100 megawatt. The average line losses decreased from 27% on the feeder to 7%. And up to now, some 265 million kilowatt hours of solar energy has been generated. So about 60,000 kilowatt hours per farmer. And they've got paid about 4 rupees per unit. Now, in this particular scheme, farmers were offered 12 hours per day of grid power because these tube wells were connected to the normal feeder. So so they had to be kept alive during the day when solar energy was generated. So they had special benefit in the sense that they got daytime power and they got an additional allowance, 12 hours per day of power instead of 8 hours that other farmers got. But they also got an FIT of $55 per 1,000 units. So that FIT strengthened incentive to conserve power and evacuate it. But daytime power and 12 hours per day, that produced an incentive, that generated an incentive to use more power for irrigation. So the net impact that we saw is basically a result of these conflicting forces. And this is what happened. We found that on those feeders where this scheme was offered, some 68% of the tube well owners, they opted for solarization. And 31% refused. They wanted to continue with their grid-connected tube wells because of the subsidy. This is the behavioral change impact that we saw in the first 2 years. And the main upshot is that the evacuation of solar energy, which was just 550 units per HP per kilowatt in the first year, shot up to more than 770. So there was a 40% jump in the amount of power that they evacuated. Notice that they also increased the amount of power that they use for agriculture, for irrigation. But the total generation also increased a great deal once they were convinced that they were actually getting paid for selling energy. This is the financial results for the government. For the farmers, of course, it's a very beneficial thing because they are, there is a 70% increase in the return that they get. But even for the government, there is and the electricity utility, there is a massive benefit because there is a reduction in the technical losses on the agricultural feeders. Number two, the entire subsidy on grid power, this is about $1,200, $1,300 per year per tube well, is now being saved on this solar pumps. So I think both farmers as well as electricity companies, this is a win-win. So I think if you look at India as a whole, India is kind of on a solar pump trip. And from next to nothing in 2015, India already has 250,000 solar pumps installed. But all these are off-grid solar pumps. All of these are given to farmers through capital cost subsidy. So farmers basically have 8 hours multiplied by 360 days of power available to pump groundwater. And a lot of that power remains unused because nobody is lifting that power, and farmers are not able to use that power for other purposes. So if you contrast these off-grid solar pumps with the Sky pilot in Gujarat and Dhudi, then these 5 or 6 questions become important. Does this model eliminate electricity subsidy? I think off-grid solar pumps do also eliminate grid power subsidy, because once farmers switch to solar power, they don't get grid power. Does it incentivize energy water conservation? Off-grid solar powers don't incentivize. Actually, they actually create a perverse incentive. But Sky tube wells or Dhudi tube wells do have a strong incentive for conserving water. Is there full utilization of solar generation? No. In case of off-grid solar pumps, just 30 to 40% of the power generated gets used. The remaining goes waste. But in Sky pilot and Dhudi, all the power that gets generated either gets used for irrigation or elsewhere in the economy. Is there farmer participation in solar investment? In case of off-grid solar pumps, there is very limited farmer participation. Basically, the government just gives it away. But in case of Sky pilots in Dhudi, farmers have a serious skin in the game. Does it ensure 100% utilization that we discussed all? And does it help reduce line losses? The first, no, it does not reduce line losses at all. But Sky pilots do help to reduce line losses. So I think that done right, Dhudi and Sky can be the most practical way of killing the incentive of groundwater depletion in India. I mentioned earlier that 25 to 30% of the groundwater that is drawn every year in India is basically because it just doesn't cost farmer anything to do that. If you find a way of cutting out this unuseful groundwater draft, we actually can create a far more sustainable groundwater regime. And maybe this is a way that we can do it, which would be acceptable to all parties concerned, including farmers, because farmers not only will reduce groundwater drought, but they will also make more money by selling power to the government. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tushaar. That was a wonderful tour through. I love both the context setting before kind of diving into the more current situation and then the last 5 years. And I just hope, I guess, along with you, that this is a solution that is rolled out and becomes more popular across India, because it does seem like a really good and positive win-win for all parties. So thank you for sharing that with us. And this next generation of students and young professionals that are hopefully listening and watching to this. Yeah.
Thanks.